expecting something else, it's okay. You're welcome to stay, or you can leave quietly. That's fine too. So today, let me just pull this up. So we're going to talk about scientific presentations. And there's three main sections that we're covering today. Why do we care about these skills? Visual aspects of scientific presentations and the oral aspects. So how many people were here on Thursday? Okay, so a couple of you don't know me yet. My name is Cindy Lee, and I'll tell you a little bit about my journey. Those of you who were already here or already know me, this might be a little boring. So for undergrad, I went to Berkeley and I studied microbial biology and linguistics. So, I think a lot of people asked, why did you pick these two different majors? A lot of times, people who are really interested in humanities just pick one, or people who are really into science just pick that one. And I told them, I'm really interested in evolution. I love studying the evolution of genes, and I love studying the evolution of languages. So for me, being able to study both linguistics and biology really allowed me to pursue two of my interests. I also did research in a lab where we did genetic engineering of plants. So those of you who were here before know that I studied sorghum, but it wasn't to make alcohol, it was to make sorghum more nutritious. And oftentimes a lot of people would be distrustful of genetic engineering. And so my PI had to explain to the community or even to other researchers why this work was so important and how we could do this work safely. This really inspired me to pursue science communication. So I wanted to then do my PhD so that I could become a scientific expert. And that took me to Ohio State, where I studied molecular, cellular, and developmental biology, and my lab did DNA repair in the context of breast cancer. So what was kind of cool about being at Ohio State was we were based in Columbus, Ohio, and there are some huge clothing companies there, and some other types of commercial products too. So there were Bath & Body Works. They do things like lotion or shower gel, things like that. There was the Limited and Express and Victoria's Secret, so men's and women's clothing. And these companies, and also Abercrombie & Fitch, I think sometimes that's also a popular brand here. So these companies made all of this money and they said, well, we'll invest in local research. So a lot of times we would get people who were doing marketing or doing clothing design, and they would come visit my lab too. So we would have to think about how to explain our work to people who probably the last time they took a biology class was when they were 15 years old. So how do we connect with that? And the advisor that you see in this picture, he always told us, think about how you would explain this work to your grandmother. And when you're talking to your PI might not be your grandmother, but think about what would be the most interesting way and what's the most clear way to explain your research, regardless of whether you're talking to an expert or a non-expert, because you want to make sure your message gets through to them, regardless of your audience. So let's talk about the first section. Why do we care about these skills? Science communication is a pretty straightforward term. It's just two words. So let's talk about science. I think it's pretty interesting. How many people are studying what you're studying because you think it's interesting? Okay. How many people are studying what you're studying because you think you might be able to help people? All right. I hope more of you will be able to help people in the future. So that's great. That's why we're doing research, but the communication part of this is important too, right? So if you think what you're doing is very cool, don't you want to share that with other people? Don't you want to tell your neighbors or your friends, like, hey, this is really interesting? Yeah. Also, who's paying for this research? How many of you have written a grant application? Some of you. Maybe more of you will do that in the future. Hans, why didn't you raise your hand? Have you written a grant application? Yeah. So someday you might be in a position to apply for funding for an entire lab. But even before that, you might be able to apply for funding for just yourself. Maybe it's for you to this happens too in presentations. We'll just pretend that we know this message. So you might be able to apply for funding for a particular type of work, or if a particular company is pushing a new reagent and they're willing to give you a sample for you to work on. Or maybe you want to travel to a conference in a beautiful location like Paris. You need funding for that, right? So that's why it's important when you think something is cool to be able to share it with other people. As for the helping part, you know, I did basic research, so I talked about DNA repair. We could get results in our lab, but if we didn't publish those results, no one would be able to use that for further studies, whether it's clinical trials or finding new tumors to measure or finding drugs to test. So that's why it's really important to share our results, right? Okay, so that's the first part, why we think science communication is important. Let's see if this stabilizes.
请问楼上的这要不要再调整一下？
哦，好，那我们就继续。All right, so we're going to continue. They're taking care of this, and let's hope this doesn't make anyone sick. So let's look at the visual aspects of scientific presentations. There are 3 main take-home messages I would like you to have from this. 1 is you should have a unified design. 2 is you should understand who your audience is. And 3 is negative space. So don't worry, we'll talk about all of these in detail. So with a unified design, the idea is that you want your visual message to be very clear. I think you'll notice that my slide is very plain, right? I don't have very much going on. And in this particular case, I don't have any interesting figures. I didn't do any microscopy before I came to give this talk. But if you have, for instance, microscopy images, or if you have some other figures, you want people to be able to see your figures very clearly. Or if you have keywords that you're showing, you want people to see those very clearly. You don't want to clutter up your screen with other information that's not relevant to your message. You also want people to be able to see your screen. All right, fingers crossed. Thank you. Now, all right, we'll try this for a bit. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that it's important to have a clear design. This often becomes a problem when you are a PI and you have multiple people in your lab, and you know it's time for you to let your funding agencies know, like, oh, we've done this, this, and this in my lab. So the PI goes to the students, and this student really likes this font, and this student really likes the color orange, and this student just threw together something last night. And so that PI's presentation doesn't look very unified, and that can be very distracting to your audience. So, because you are in control of your own data, you can at least make sure your message is consistent throughout. And one way you can do that is by using master slides to design in your PowerPoint presentations. So we'll go through how that goes. I know everyone has a slightly different version of PowerPoint, and sometimes people like to use other programs like Keynote, but this is kind of a general skill that you might be able to use, just your version might look slightly different. So if you go to View, and you go to Slide Master, you're going to be able to edit your master slide. And all of those home menu stuff, all of that is still in there. So you're able to choose what font you want all of your slides to be. You're able to maybe make a little logo or something to design to make all of your slides look the same. That way someone who walks in the middle of your presentation still knows, oh yeah, this is what the talk is. So I just did something simple. I went into the shapes and I drew a square, but then I copied it a bunch of times, and I think you're all probably very computer proficient, probably more so than I am, so you don't necessarily need this reminder that it's Control-C, Control-V, but in case you do, there are a lot of nice keyboard shortcuts that you can use. All right, so I copy-pasted a bunch of squares, but this is not a useful logo. So what I do is I move one square to the far right, and then I select all of them, and I go to this menu item. It's called Arrange. So if you go to Arrange, and you go to Align, and you distribute horizontally, it spaces them out evenly horizontally. And you'll notice in that menu there's also Distribute Vertically. So, because we look at data and we come to a conclusion with our data, you can conclude that doing that would space them out equally vertically. All right, so now I've put this together, but I want to adjust it a little bit more. So I still have all of them selected, and I go to the same menu, I go to Align, and I select Align Middle. That means that now they're all lined up on the same axis. All right, let's just move them to the bottom of the slide. So now I have this little design, and because I did this in the master slide, it's going to show up on all of the slides. So you go to the close master, and what you can do is save this as a template. Because if you save this as a template, that means in the future, anytime you want to do a presentation, you can just pick up this template. You don't have to recreate this design every single time. So if I save this as a template, the next time I start a new presentation, normally when you open up PowerPoint, it'll have the featured template. So these are the designs that PowerPoint provides, which some of them are quite nice. It depends on what you're trying to show on your screen. But if you click over to Personal, you can see these are the templates that I often have to use in my work. I sometimes have to report on what my facility has been doing to the United States Department of Energy. So that's this second one here. Sometimes we have announcements for lunchtime activities. So this is the template that I use for that. This is a seminar announcement. So it's really helpful to have these shortcuts for the kinds of slides or the kinds of designs that you often use. So that's just a simple way to make sure you have this unified look. We talked a little bit before about how when I was in grad school, we had these local companies like Bath & Body Works or Abercrombie & Fitch. And I think I see someone wearing an Abercrombie & Fitch shirt right here. All of their clothing has their logo on it, right? So you can recognize immediately that's this brand. So I want you to think of yourself as being a brand. You want people to recognize you as having pretty good science and a pretty clear message. Another thing that you should consider when you're designing a presentation, whether it's on screen or in print, is using consistent fonts. You'll notice I have different sizes, different weights, and different styles on this slide, right? But is this necessary? I don't think so. I'm breaking this up. Every time I change my font, I emphasize something different. But this distracts the audience from my message. So you want people to pay attention to the important stuff, your results. You don't want people to wonder, oh, why is that word purple? Or why is that word green? Or why is that word bigger? Sometimes you do need to change your fonts. So if your title is at the top, oftentimes that's a little bit bigger, it's in bold. So that's important to consider. But if your message isn't actually changing in meaning, you probably don't need to change your style or your size. You also want to think about your audience. So I told you that my advisor used to always say, describe it so your grandmother can understand. But right now, I'm not talking to my grandmother, right? I'm talking, and I assume most of this audience is students. So I am trying to target my presentation to students. You also want to consider whether people will be looking at this on screen or on paper, and whether you are the one explaining or not. So let's talk about this. If you are having something on screen, I recommend sans serif font. So this is a font like Helvetica or Arial or Calibri. So that's that first bullet point. That's a sans serif font. The next bullet point is a serif font. So you'll notice it has a little feet, right? So if it's something that you'll print out and hand to people, they generally think that serif fonts are easier to read. This is Times New Roman. I personally don't like Times New Roman, but it is easier to read for people who are printing it out. So it's something to consider. You also want to make sure your text is large enough to read. So, my presentation templates have these preset sizes. Sometimes PowerPoint will change your size because you're trying to fit too much text on one slide. If that happens to you, that's a sign that you're putting too much on one slide. Generally, when you are giving a presentation, you should probably allot 1 minute per slide. So if you think about how, if I had 5 more bullet points on here, that would probably take me too long to go through, right? So if your words are getting smaller, that's a sign, it's a reminder. You should probably break that up into 2 or even 3 slides. And if you think about your audience, I don't know about you, I'm not going to accuse any of you for anything, but I know that when I sit in a lecture hall and sometimes the lights are dim and the person's been talking for a long time, I fall asleep easily. And I don't know about you, maybe you get a little bit sleepy too. But, it happens. So let's say someone falls asleep and then suddenly they're awake. But they might be completely lost because if the whole slide is filled with text, they don't know where you are. But if you only have one main message per slide, it'll be very easy for them to catch up. And you want them to be able to catch up because whatever you're talking about is very interesting. So I have an example. Those of you who took my workshops in the past will have probably seen this. One of my friends did her PhD at Yale. So I asked her for an example of a poster that she made. So there's some things that I think are great. I think that she's set apart her titles for each section so that you can see like, oh, this is a new section. However, I think that there's maybe a bit too much text on here. And I'm not sure what happened here. I think you'll notice at the top there are multiple authors, so they probably tried to fit a lot onto one poster. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes your PI says, look, all of you are working on this project, make one poster. That way, when you go to a conference, you can use this poster. And when you go to something else, you can use this poster. And when you have your seminar, you can use this. Maybe that's just what you need for that particular situation. But if you are in control of your own poster design, I definitely recommend making sure that there's, less text. I think that something else happened when she emailed this to me. The logo of Yale University ended up in kind of a weird spot. So this is also something that you should consider. If you are sending your presentation ahead, so for instance, when I was coming here, I emailed the administrators ahead of time and I said, here's my presentation in PDF, please feel free to send this out to the students. If you're printing a poster, most of us don't have a huge poster printer at home, right? They're super expensive and they take a lot of space. So usually you have to send it to a printer or you have to email that file somewhere. You want to make sure you email your file in a format that the printer will be able to read because you don't want to go to your conference and then open up your tube and realize, oh, there's, the special symbols I used didn't show up, or the microscopy images that I spent so much time working on aren't showing up. That's a waste of your time and it's a waste of your money. So you want to make sure, test this often, figure out what format is suitable for your audience. I I will also show you a poster that I did while I was in grad school. And you'll notice here, it's that same thing. So these were supposed to be Western blots. I don't know how many of you do Western blots, and this was also old school technology. I was still using films. I think a lot of people don't use films anymore when they do Western blots. But when I downloaded this file, all of those disappeared. So that's a problem, right? That's a waste of my work. Someone who comes to my poster won't be able to see that, and they're going to wonder, well, are you actually showing me data, or are you faking it? We don't want people to think we're faking our data. That's not a good thing. You'll also notice here, these are some of my microscopy images. So if you look on this version, you can probably see about 3 boxes that have results, right? On my computer, all of these have something in them. So this is also something you want to consider. If you are presenting in a large lecture hall like this, or even if it's a smaller classroom but the lights are dim, are people going to be able to see this? A lot of projectors, you never know which classroom you're going to be assigned, right? So if you're giving a seminar in your own institute and you're able to go check out your seminar room in advance, you should definitely connect your computer to the projector and see, if you sit in the back, are you still able to see very clearly what your result is? You want your audience to be able to be convinced of your message. If I try to tell you, well, this cell did not get repaired, but this cell did get repaired, but to you, they look exactly the same, are you going to believe me? I don't think so. I wouldn't believe me. And when you're reading journal articles, you should also be questioning all of the results, right? How many of you have Journal Club in your labs? Do you feel like sometimes your PI is very picky about the data that they see? Yeah, I think sometimes the PIs are even pickier than the reviewers. So you want to make sure it's clear so that they're absolutely confident in the work that they're presenting to you. So now we've talked a little bit about both oral presentations and poster presentations. So I want to talk to you a little bit more about some of those differences. So when I'm standing here, I have the slides next to me, right? And when I'm at a poster session, I also have my poster next to me. But sometimes I'm walking away because there's really good snacks over there. So I don't want to stand in my poster the whole time. Or maybe at the last minute, I'm not able to travel to this conference, but my coworker is going. So my coworker will put my poster up for me. So I want to make sure that anyone who sees my poster can follow that story even if I'm not standing there. Whereas with an oral presentation, I'm pretty sure I'm standing next to my words. So in that situation, you can consider how much you want to put. So for a poster, your whole story needs to be on there. It needs to be a clear story, but all of that has to be clear even if you're not explaining. For this kind of presentation, I can just put some of the keywords on there, and then my speaking part is what allows you to understand the full story. Does that make sense? Okay. Something that I didn't mention here, but that I hope that you'll consider in the future is also accessibility. So, I think a lot of us are very lucky. We're able to hear clearly, we're able to see clearly, but not everyone in an audience may be able to do that. So if you have a bright white background and you use very light colored font, let's say I use a light yellow, that's hard to see, right? Even for people who can see clearly, it's hard to see yellow on white. Or if I had a black background and I used a dark blue font, that would be hard to read too. So that's also something you want to consider. You can make your slides look really cool, very beautiful, but you also want to make sure whatever you're trying to highlight, whatever you're trying to print out is still clear. So that also goes along with making sure your font size is large enough. You also want to make sure the color is clear. One more thing that I want to talk to you about when we're talking about the visual aspects is negative space or white space. It's important to give your eyes a rest. So that's also why you don't want just a full block of text on screen. You want to kind And I think this is also something when we write. You want to use your punctuation carefully, because if you write 20 words versus if you write 40 words and there's no period in there, I think sometimes we get a little bit tired, even if we're reading silently. If you're reading a sentence out loud and there's no period, by the end of your sentence, you might kind of be out of breath. But you can apply the same principle to the visual design too. You want to be able to breathe. So I really highly recommend going to this website called Canva. And some of you who've been in my classes already know this. But they have a lot of design tutorials, and it helps you understand some of these design concepts. I personally don't have a design background. I told you what I studied. And I think that a lot of the principles that people who learn visual design, that can be helpful when we're trying to convey our scientific results too. So this particular tutorial that I have on there is about white space, but they have others like how to pick colors that work together, or what kinds of dimensions you should use. So I definitely recommend that you check this out. Again, they should be sending out the slides, so you'll have access to all of this information. So now we've talked about the visual design. Let's talk a little bit about speaking about science. So if you'll remember, at the beginning, I told you we're talking about 3 things, right? So that's important. At the beginning, you should outline. And this is also what you should do before you even start talking, right? At home, when you're practicing, you should be thinking, well, what's the beginning of my story? What's the middle of my story? What's the end of my story? And this is relevant whether you're just explaining your work to your grandmother or your neighbor, or if you're talking to your PI. I think your PI is probably trained to read journal articles. And how are journal articles set up? They have some introduction with the background or other experiments that have been done in this field and what's their scientific question. And then they get their data, and then at the end there's the discussion, right? If your PI is used to this format, doesn't it make sense to follow that format when you're talking to your PI? You want your boss to think that you're doing your work very organized, right? So you want to be as clear when you're telling your story as you can. You also want to make gestures very carefully. So I know for me personally, I have a tendency to talk with my hands. I like to wave my hands around. But that can be distracting to the audience. You can also be someone who just stands very still, but you want to convey confidence. So sometimes if someone's just hidden away and their body language is all curled up, that doesn't convey confidence, and it doesn't convey confidence in your own work. Something that you can consider. So in this particular room, they offered me these microphones, and they also offered me a little microphone that I could pin. In this case, I didn't bring a clicker for advancing my slides, so I told them, no, don't worry, I'll just stay back here, and I will use both of these microphones. But if you think that your presentation is well suited for movement, make sure you do have that small microphone. Make sure you do have a slide advancer or a pointer, and then you can just walk around on the stage however you'd like. Again, you want to make sure that this is helping you tell the story. If you're trying to move closer to one side of the stage because you can engage with that side of the audience, or if you're trying to talk about something in particular on screen, that's a useful gesture. If you're just walking around back and forth because that way you can avoid looking at the audience, that might not be a useful gesture. This is a situation where it's good to practice with people, because while they're watching you, they can give you feedback. It's also perhaps useful if you record yourself. I know sometimes people feel a little bit awkward watching themselves or listening to themselves, but this is how you improve. And if you don't want to let other people listen to you practice, it's okay. You can just record it and you can watch it yourself. When you're talking about eye contact, you don't want to just focus on one person the entire time. That gives them a lot of pressure. So what I recommend is getting to a break in your sentence. Either you finish your whole sentence or you get to a comma in your sentence, and then you move on to the next person. That way nobody feels left out, but nobody feels like all of the attention is on them. Okay, so I've told you a little bit about talking, so now we'll talk a little bit more about the differences between the oral presentation and the poster presentation. Again, it's very easy to get lost. Sometimes when we're talking about complicated scientific results, we've talked about this kind of data and that kind of data, and then this is a whole new project. So you don't want people to get lost in your talk. That's why at the beginning of your talk, you'll say, this is what I'm telling you about today. And then at the end of your talk, you say, this is what I told you about. So it's a nice reminder at the end. And it also gives people a little roadmap at the beginning. So that way, if they were listening at the beginning, they'll have an idea, oh, well, I think we're about halfway through, or I think there's probably 5 minutes left. It's also good for you to practice in advance so that you know, all right, when I have about 20 minutes left, I should already be at this slide. I think we've all been to symposia or colloquia where the speakers go over, right? And sometimes the host doesn't do a good job of stopping them. And that's very rude to the people who are going later, because if your first talk goes over by 5 minutes and then the next talk goes over by 5 minutes, that means you're already 10 minutes late for the third person, and then it just snowballs from there. So I really hope that you're all good speakers and good hosts. And if you are in a situation where you're hosting, it's part of your duty to rein in that speaker. Give them a reminder, hey, you have about 5 minutes left. Oh, that would be great. Why don't you continue this discussion later, afterward? We're out of time now. It's respectful of everybody's time if we all stay on schedule. So for poster presentations, again, you may be standing next to your poster, you might not be standing next to your poster. So you want to think about what happens if you're talking to people and you're able to point to different things on your poster. So is your poster arranged in a way that makes sense? If you have your background information and your conclusion all on one side, does that mean you start here and then you jump over here and then you're jumping back? You might not have that much room to maneuver at a poster session. Sometimes they're all pretty close together and they're pretty popular and you're trying to talk to this particular poster judge. So you want to make it easy to follow. So here, and then here, and then here, and then here. It's easy for you to point to something. It's easier for them to look at what you're pointing to. And this is also a situation where the more you practice, the better you'll get. I can't replicate that condition at home. I don't know what a judge can hear because sometimes there's nobody else in that particular row of posters, but sometimes the room is full and it's super noisy. So it's often good to check in and make sure that whoever you're talking to, whether it's another student or it's someone who's judging your poster, you want to make sure they can hear you. So that's why I like to check in every now and then. Oh, did that make sense? And as part of being a good audience, it's good to say, oh no, I don't understand, or wait, what did you mean? Or yeah, I got that. And there's always this interaction, and I think that's helpful in presentations. So one more thing about the gestures. So when I give an oral presentation, one of the reasons why I don't have a slide advancer is because a lot of times they're also connected to laser pointers. And I think that when you have a laser pointer in your hand, it's very natural to start pointing. So I know we're in Taiwan. How many people have done KTV? Come on, it's probably more than that, right? All right, so when you go sing karaoke and they have the images on screen, what do? Is it just the words? There's usually a little dot where it highlights the words, right? So you know where you should be singing. All right, this is not karaoke. So I don't need to take my laser pointer and point at this word, and then this word, and then this word, unless I call on someone, okay, now read this for me, right? I find that very distracting, and I think it's unnecessary. When you're using a laser pointer, it should be to point at something in particular, usually because You're saying, oh, look at this particular region of an image. But you don't necessarily need a laser pointer for that. What if your laser pointer doesn't show up on screen? That's why I like to use circles or arrows that are built into the presentation. So that's my personal style. I just recommend that if you do decide to use laser pointers or other things like that you use them effectively and carefully. With your poster presentation, you can point to things because you're right there. And just keep in mind that you're also standing in front of the text. So if you're trying to explain to the visitor, look at this microscopy image, but you're also blocking it with your body, that's not going to be very effective. So always be conscious of where you're standing and where the viewer is standing. All right, so now we've talked about gestures. I want to move on to eye contact. So I already told you this last bit, you can finish a sentence or finish a thought before you move on. But let's talk about some of the other things. Why do I talk about your experiments here? Because confidence is important. So if you set up your experiment to answer a particular question, you want to make sure that experiment actually answers the question you're asking, right? If it doesn't answer your question, you're wasting your time. Okay, so I've set up my experiment and I'm confident that this is going to help me answer this question. Then I can carefully do my experiment, and knowing that, I can probably trust my results, right? We usually want to experiment and then repeat those experiments, but by the end of it, you should feel confident in your product, right? And you also check in with other people like your PI or people in your lab. If you submit a paper, they have reviewers who look at what you've done because they want to make sure everyone can feel confident in your work, right? Okay, so when we get to a point where we're talking about our research, we should feel confident and you should be able to stand there and let people know, yes, I believe in this work. I think that we did this correctly and you can trust this data. So if you feel that confidence, it's because you've prepared carefully and you have evidence. So in that case, you can feel very comfortable sharing your work. If you're not comfortable, ask yourself why. Is it because you didn't set up the experiment correctly? Well, if that's the case, just go back and make sure you've done everything correctly. Practice your talk. So I practiced and I found that my sweet spot is going through my presentation 3 times. As you practice, you'll figure out what your sweet spot is. I think that if I don't practice my talk 3 times, I am not confident enough. But if I practice my talk more than 3 times, sometimes it feels too memorized. And in that case, you don't actually need me to stand here. I could just type everything out and then you could just read it at home. Having a presentation is still this interaction. And so that's why it's important to figure out how many times you should practice in order for you to feel comfortable making that connection with your audience. Okay, so in summary, we have talked about why we want to do science communication, why we care about this, how to design our slides or our posters effectively, and we've talked about how to give an oral presentation. What are we caring about when we're speaking next to our words and next to our figures? So notice that I also started with this is what we're talking about today, and now I'm ending with this is what we talked about today. So at this point, I am happy to take your questions, especially because the screen has decided that we're done.